morning, everybody. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Al Uy. I want to put a little bit of context into the purpose of this talk. We currently live in a society that has grown increasingly apathetic of scientific evidence, one that perceives broadly accepted findings as merely one side of an imaginary debate fought by pundits and financed by special interests. From climate change to evolutionary theory to public health policies and education, our lives seem to oscillate between the immediacy of events happening around us, think about hurricanes, species extinction, epidemics, and the elusiveness of the underlying processes driving those events at various scales of time. At a moment in which doing science can be seen as a subversive act, one just have to look at recent legislation proposals and executive orders aimed at undermining the relevance of scientific work related to environmental protection, public health, education, and basic science, and the response coming from within those agencies, it is clear that continued exposure to scientific discovery in a context that emphasizes its relevance is of utmost importance. In that light, we have today's speaker. Dr. Uy is the Aresty Chair in Tropical Ecology and Associate Professor of Biology at the University of Miami. He obtained his bachelor's degree in integrative biology at the University of California, Berkeley in 1994, and his Ph.D. in biology at the University of Maryland, College Park in 2000. Dr. Uy has spent the last 20+ years studying many aspects of evolutionary processes, from the role of variation with the species in adapting to new environments to the consequences of hybridization and the ability of species to respond to urbanization, particularly in the context of species extinction. Given the importance of bringing research out of the strict scientific communities onto the wider public, Dr. Uy and his team have worked on several ways to effectively make his science more accessible. Islands of Creation is a 50-minute documentary that follows their work in a remote region of the Solomon Islands, and we had the pleasure of screening the video last night. It also highlights conservation initiatives in this highly imperiled biodiversity spot. The documentary was created by Nate Lappin and Neil Lawson of Days Edge Productions. It was co-produced by the Smithsonian Channel. So today, Dr. Uy is going to talk a little bit about his research, and so without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Al Uy to FNM.
Well, thanks for the invite and for hosting us. It's been really fun meeting new friends and seeing old friends. Also, coming from Miami, where we left, it was about 70 degrees, I think. It actually is a welcome change to have winter, so I'm pretty excited to experience it. So as Jorge had mentioned, you know, my lab group and myself have been studying speciation or the origin of species and evolution in the wild for almost 20 years, or over 20 years, I should say. And over the past few years, it's become apparent that, you know, being a basic scientist is no longer enough. And so what has happened is an organic and natural transition to doing basic science and applied science. So what I'm going to talk about today is a snippet of some of the work we've been doing in the Solomon Islands as scientists, and then end it with some of the work that we're now doing as conservation biologists. And, you know, I'd like to kind of say from the start, I'm not trained conservation biologist, so whatever we do there has come about just basically learning as we go along and developing the basic science into applied science. So the planet is diverse. When you travel the world, or actually even if you go outside, what you do not see is a single organism being able to do everything. What you see instead are groups of organisms that have found unique ways to exploit the environment. So for instance, in this collage from the Meet Your Neighbors initiative from the internet, you have organisms that have found ways to harness the energy of the sun to produce food, their own food. And then you have organisms that have found ways to eat the organisms that can harness the energy of the sun to create their own food. And then you have organisms that have found ways to eat the organisms that produce or harness the energy of the sun to produce their own food. Right? So these organisms have found ways to exploit their environment, and this is where diversity really comes from. But even if you focus on a smaller group, here represented by a hummingbird, birds, what you see also is a diversity of an ability to exploit the environment. Right? You have birds that eat insects, birds that eat seeds, birds that eat each other, birds that eat carrion, and so forth. Right? So even in a smaller scale, within bird family, you see this great diversity in exploiting the environment. And in fact, another way diversity can happen, looking even smaller scale, looking at hummingbirds only, for instance, is the way they communicate. So for instance, all hummingbirds in this image have evolved unique ways to exploit nectar, so they have different beak sizes. But what you really see from this diversity of hummingbirds is a diversity of colors, right? And this is the way they communicate. So basically, in a nutshell, this great diversity that we see out there is a diversity in how organisms feed, survive, and how they communicate with each other. And it's this great diversity that we've spent 20 years trying to understand. How does this diversity come from? And in essence, if I had to encapsulate my life right now, is our lab is trying to understand how this diversity originated and how it's being maintained in nature. Now, as we begin to understand diversity and the importance of diversity, unfortunately, we're also facing a threat of loss of diversity. So this is a heat map of our planet, and it's heat map showing the hottest parts are where the greatest threat to diversity is. And you can see it's not homogeneous, it's not equal across the globe, and certain parts of the world is more susceptible to extinction. And the biggest part where the greatest extinctions are happening happens to be in the tropics, in the middle there near the equator. And unfortunately, this is also the place where most developing nations are. So you can see the struggle that we're faced with. As populations grow, extinction also is happening. And in fact, throughout the history of our planet, the 4 billion years this planet has been here, and this is just showing the half a billion years of history, there's been 5 mass extinction events. These are events that are characterized with massive loss of species diversity happening within the span of 1 million to 2 million years. And as I said, there's only been 5 in the 4 billion, and in this case, half a billion years of life on Earth. Probably the most famous one is the Cretaceous Tertiary, the last one there, where all the dinosaurs went extinct. So we know these mass extinction events happened, but they're pretty rare. And scientists are now arguing, and actually starting to see, that we may be in the face of the 6th mass extinction event. And this one's unique, because this extinction event, if it is a 6th mass extinction event, is driven by us. It's uniquely driven by a single species on the planet. So what's the evidence for this? So here's just looking at a study actually trying to quantify whether we are in the heart of a 6th mass extinction event. So basically the study looks at, in the past 140 years, we know the number of species that have gone extinct on the planet. But we can also go back a couple of million years to see the background extinction. In other words, how many species go extinct naturally in the past 2 million years? So comparing the number of species that have gone extinct in the past 140 years, we can ask, if it was natural, how long would it have taken for those 140 years of extinction to happen naturally? So let me just show you this one. Probably the best one to look at here is the amphibian, the frogs over there. In essence, the number of frogs that went extinct in 140 years, or amphibians, it would have taken anywhere from 2,000 to 10,000 years for it to naturally go extinct. So that's almost 100 times faster than would have occurred naturally. So if you look at this across vertebrates, you have fish, reptiles, you have birds and mammals. Most scientists now agree we are facing one of the sixth mass extinction event of our planet's history. And so basically what I'm going to talk about today is what we're doing as scientists to understand diversity, and then I'm going to end with what we're doing now in a smaller scale, what my lab group's doing to help conserve this diversity, to help at least slow down the 6th mass extinction event. So when looking at diversity, speciation, or the process of the origin of species, probably the best way to do it, because we're looking at a long evolutionary history, is to think of our diversity as a family tree. So this is the big cats. You have jaguars, leopards, and lions are closely related. You have tigers and snow leopards are all each other's closest relative. So in essence, to understand where this diversity comes from, what we're doing is trying to understand what's happening at this fork, right? Basically, tigers and snow leopards shared a common ancestor a couple million years ago. What we really want to understand is what happened at that fork. And the study of the origin of species, the study of speciation, is the study of what happened at that fork. So that's what we're doing. And nobody can talk about evolution without talking about Charles Darwin. It's Darwin's birthday next week, and so this is kind of appropriate. But as a young lad, your age, Darwin got on a boat, and he was the ship's naturalist. He ended up traveling the world and ended up in Galapagos, where this little ship stopped. And Darwin, as a young lad collecting birds and so forth, noticed that he was seeing these birds that look very similar, but they're different enough that maybe they're different species, but they're so close that you can't quite call them different species. And he argued that this is a representative of those situations where you're at the fork of that tree that I just showed you. And this is just an excerpt from one of his journals where he says basically, one of species had been taken and modified for different ends. In other words, this idea of a species as being stagnant and not evolving is actually constantly moving and changing. And he saw this in the Galapagos, among other places that he had been. So since this is a general audience, I'm going to just mention in a few slides what Darwin's thoughts were and how revolutionary it is, because this idea of evolution by natural selection is so elegantly simple that it's hard to fathom why it's so controversial, right? So Darwin basically argued, this is how natural selection and this is how evolution works. You start with a population that's variable, just like this room. We look around, you'll see we all have different hair color, different height, and so forth. So a population is variable. In this example, to honor Darwin, we're looking at Darwin's finches. So let's say there were a bunch of finches living on an island, some with this big beak, some with smaller beak, and they are specializing in different kinds of food. The big guys can eat the big seed, the small guys can eat the small seeds, which makes sense. Something happens, let's say got rid of all the big seeds, El Nino wiped it out, it's a drought. And what happens then, as you can imagine, just by sheer natural processes, the small ones get to survive because they're the ones that can eat it, and the big ones go away, they die, right? And so when what happens is all you have left are small guys, they're gonna mate and produce more small guys, so that you start off with a population that's this variable to a population that looks smaller. And that's evolution, right? You're just you're changing the composition of the population because some are just better adapted at the conditions you're found. In this case, seed size. And if you repeat this process over and over and over again, what you get is a diversity of organisms that have found ways to eat different things. So in the Darwin's finch example, they've been in the Galapagos for 2 million years, and what resulted with this iterations of billions of iterations of natural selection are some species that eat seeds, some species that eat fruits, and so forth. You get this huge diversity. And the way these species are maintained and formed is that basically the small guys will mate with the other small ones, the big ones with the small ones, and they don't mate with each other. Because if the big ones mate with a small one, they're going to produce offspring that really do not quite fit in the environment. Or maybe they've been separated long enough that if they tried to breed, it would have problems, like sterile. Like the horse and the donkey create mules. And so that's a very simple process, basically, of how species are born, right? Iterations of natural selection, choosing the best fit individuals in a population, and then enough time separating them, they become this basically inability to interbreed. But even Darwin himself didn't quite realize or didn't quite understand what's going on, and he concluded his book basically calling this, the book that's called On the Origin of Species, he called the origin of species as the mystery of mysteries. So for 150 years, we've still been trying to figure out, and so this is where we all kind of stand on the shoulder of the great giant Darwin to try to figure out the origin of species, the origin of this great diversity that we see in this planet. So he was at the Galapagos. Where I'm going to take you today is the Solomon Islands. So the Solomon Islands, if you guys have forgotten your geography, I'm sure a lot of folks have, it's in the South Pacific, right off the coast of New Guinea, near Australia, in that square. And the bird that we're going to look at is this chestnut-bellied flycatcher. This is an Australasian. These are birds that are endemic to Australia and parts of Asia. They have evolved similar behavior and physical appearance as the flycatchers we see outside. They're unrelated, although they look almost the same. They're insectivorous. They only eat insects. They're socially monogamous, meaning males and females will pair up, defend their nests, and basically defend a territory from other pairs. And all those things are normal things you see in songbirds. Like if you go outside, a lot of the songbirds you'll see do this thing. But what makes this species great and why we chose it is that they're variable throughout the Solomon Islands. So here again is the map of the Solomon Islands. In these orange islands, birds look like that. They are black on top and chestnut brown in the belly. When you get to the blue islands here, all of a sudden birds have the white crescent moon in front of their eyes. When you get to these red islands, they have a white cap that males kind of flare out to display to females. And then when you get to these small, tiny islands off the orange islands, they've lost the chestnut and birds are entirely black. And interestingly, too, in these green islands, you have birds that are both either black or chestnut. So scientists have really looked at this and said, like, this could be an example of that fork on the road to becoming new species, because you have some populations that look very similar and are just subtly different, that these could be the beginnings of the origin of species. So I read about this group when I was a grad student and realized, oh, I really want to do this. But at the time, the Solomon Islands was still politically unstable, so I literally had to wait 10 or 15 years before I can get in there. Now, what I discovered is that they are variable in plumage, as these pictures shows you, but they also differ in song. So throughout the range in the orange islands and the blue, they sing this very simple, melancholy, kind of sad song. You hear it in the forest early in the morning. You get to the red islands, it's similar, but shorter. And you can see it from those sonograms there, the graph. It shows that the notes themselves are similar, but they're much, much shorter. Now it gets interesting when you get to the islands where they're black, melanic. The song now is like this double whistle note, like, and interestingly, that orange island next to the melanic, to the black population, sing a different song as well. So we were pretty excited with this, right? Because what we think, looking for understanding what happened at that fork, the fork in the road to the new species, we really need to find populations that are on the verge of becoming new species. And we thought this is it. This would be a great place to start. And so for this portion of the talk, I'm going to fly through this so that we have time for questions and answers at the end. I'm going to try to answer 3 questions. What's the history of this group? So what if they have different colors and song? It may be important to us because we can see it, but do the birds care? And then ultimately, one of the holy grails that a lot of people studying the origin of species is, can we find the genetic basis for the difference in colors? Because remember, for Darwinian natural selection to work, parents have to be able to pass on the traits that made them good to the next generation. So we need to figure out what the genetics is behind this ability to have different colors. So to create the evolutionary history of the group, we have to rely on genetics, and basically we use the genetics to construct a family tree, the way we would do for humans, right? So for instance, if you have very similar genetic makeup, so your brother and sisters, you're going to be closer together, so you're on the edge of this fork. Your cousins will be further out, second cousins, first cousins will be further out, and ultimately strangers are totally unrelated to you. So they branch right off this tree of, family tree. Similarly, we can do that at the species level. And for our group, this is what we found. So not surprisingly, the entire group forms one group, or called a clade, that if you time it using a molecular clock, it's about 500,000 years ago when they split from another species that's gray and chestnut from mainland New Guinea. There's not a lot of surprising thing here, but the most interesting thing we've found so far that I'm going to focus on today is that melanic black population groups with one of that chestnut brown population next to it as a really young group. And so we figured, although we've studied all these other species, I'm going to focus on this two because this, I think, is an example of that fork in the road to becoming new species. So, as I said, who cares about color and song? So one possibility is the birds don't care. Like people in this room, we may not care if we find a mate that has blonde hair or black hair or brown hair. So maybe just like in birds, it doesn't matter that one is black-bellied and one is chestnut-bellied. And if that's the case, then they're not becoming new species, if they're just choosing to mate with everybody, regardless of color. At the opposite extreme there is if they totally refuse to breed, or if they breed and the offspring are all screwed up. And that would mean then that they're reproductively isolated, they are distinct species. But at that fork of the road, it's probably somewhere in the middle, where there's probably a slowdown, probably a reduction of interbreeding, and that is just partial, and that's where we're catching them as they become distinct species. So those are the three general possibilities that we think could be happening with the differences in plumage color. So we can't interview them, like we can't talk to birds, so we have to come up with ways to figure out how to determine whether plumage and song matter. So what we did then is we made taxidermy mounts, just like if you go to the museum, you'll see these stuffed birds, and use an iPod. And the idea here is that we would present living birds. If you remember, I said that males aggressively defend territories from other individuals of the same species. So the idea here is we would present these aggressive males with birds either that look like them, brown-bellied, or either birds that don't look like them, and then gauge how they react. If they react aggressively, that means they're recognizing that bird as a member of its species or population. If they don't, they're recognizing it as something else. And because birds also fight over food, not just mates, we have a control, and our control is this bird here, the golden whistler. And this is a bird that lives in the same habitat as the flycatchers, eats the same food, but is completely unrelated, so we know that they're different species. And we decided to study this in a brown population here in Star Harbor, next to Santa Ana, a black population, and literally it's about 4 miles apart. So for a bird, that's like crossing a hallway, right? Super, super close. And so for us, it makes sense. These birds really are close together. They're likely to interact. They're likely to just fly over. And so if we test whether a brown bird recognizes the black bird or not, is a biologically real thing because that's very easy for them to cross over. And the things, our predictions, or the things that we can do. So for instance, if we tested a brown bird with that whistler mount and a whistler song, it should ignore it, right? The aggression should go down. They don't even react to it. Alternatively, if we give it a brown bird with a brown song, it should be really angry, and it should really react to it. It recognizes it as a member of its own species because it's competing for mates. If we give it the black mount and black song, it should be reduced, maybe not as low as that golden whistler because they're still closely related, but it should be lower than when we presented it with the brown mount and brown song. And if we flip-flop it, brown mount, black song, black mount, brown song, it should be somewhere in the middle, right? We're kind of messing with them to see which one matters and what matters. Here's, from our documentary, here's a video of how well this experiment worked. There's a mount, taxidermy mount sitting there. Here's an angry male coming down. So, they do recognize it. They recognize it as something, as a competitor. And that one, we've had it because the filmmakers left it there for half an hour, and so the head was kind of falling off. But they really do get angry, and they'll keep at it until it disappears. So it does work. Okay, so here's what we found. So this are for the brown birds. Again, here on the vertical axis, positive number means it's really angry, it's attacking. Negative numbers means it's ignoring it, it doesn't recognize it. So we see that the golden whistler, that yellow bird, it ignores it. It's a really, really negative number. And if we give it the brown bird and the brown song, it attacks it. If we give it the wrong song, the attack goes down. If we give it the right song but the wrong color, it goes down even more. And obviously, when we give it the black bird and black song, it goes down. Not as much as the whistler, because they are still at that early stage of being different species, or at least starting to become species. So they still recognize each other, but clearly in a different way they would a brown bird and a brown song. Conversely, we can test the blackbirds, we see the same pattern, right? They ignore the golden whistler, they really attack their own kind. You mess with a song, it goes down. You mess with a color, it goes down. You mess with both, it goes down. So clearly what we found is that the differences in color and song do matter. However you want to interpret it, it matters in recognizing competitors. It matters in recognizing competitors for mates because they're not fighting with the competitors for food, that yellow bird. And it really suggests that plumage and song are important and are driving the two population into new species. So this is where we think we are. We are at the beginning, at the fork of the road. So then the next question then that we need to ask is, remember, these are the steps for natural selection. And the third step is really important. How are these traits being passed on from mom and dad to the offspring? And so, again, going back to that same population, because we've done experiments there and we have them banded, we wanted to look at this. So we took blood samples out of the birds to get genomic, the DNA from them, to really ascertain the differences at the genetic level that can predict color. It was like CSI kind of thing. And we decided to, because the bird genome is massive, we decided to start focusing our efforts into genes that we know work for color in other organisms. And this is the melanocortin receptor. Melanocortin receptors are found in vertebrates like you and me. It is found in, it regulates cells called melanocytes that produce melanin, basically. So here is a melanocyte cell in your skin. This is MC1R, the activator, the gateway, and attractin, another receptor that associates with it. Basically, if a protein called alpha MSH binds to it, it turns it on, and it produces eumelanin, which is black. If a Goody binds to attractin and MC1R instead of alpha MSH, it turns it off. And what you produce is pheomelanin, which is orange, yellowish kind of in color, just like this yellow, this light white sheep. So it's a very simple trigger, on or off. And so we said, well, we know this works in sheep and other vertebrates. Why not in flycatchers? So we decided to sequence this gene. Here's the actual protein of MC1R. Each circle is an amino acid, and this is the surface of the cell. And basically, just to show you, we found a single mutation right here that changes that amino acid from an acid, aspartic acid, to asparagine. Who cares, right? So then now we have to ask our question, can this mutation predict who's black and who's chestnut? So as most of you know, we inherit a copy of our genes from mom and a copy from dad, so we're what's called diploid. We have two copies. So each bird we sequence could either have two copies of aspartic acid, which would be orange in our scheme, two copies of the alternative one, asparagine, which would be black in our scheme, or one copy of each, which are called heterozygotes, which will be gray in our scheme. And so we sequence our birds here from this one small island group, but also all the other birds that we've studied, including this one that is in a different species altogether, right? This is a pie chart looking at the proportion of individuals that have a certain kind of genes for these, and they're all orange, basically meaning that every individual has two copies of aspartic acid, and they have brown bellies. We look at our brown-bellied bird down here, two copies of aspartic acid for most of them, except 3 individuals have one aspartic acid and one asparagine. 3 are heterozygote. So it's almost perfect, except for those 3 pesky individuals that have a copy each. Now we look at our blackbirds. The blackbirds have 2 copies of asparagine for the most part, except for 3 pesky birds that have 1 copy each. So initially we were scratching our heads like, well, if it's perfect, it should be all black on one, all brown on the other, none of this intermediate guys. And so we looked at it deeper. This is what 2 copies of aspartic acid looks like. Really orange, beautiful orange bellies. This is what 2 copies of asparagine look like, pure black. So what do you think those gray, 1 copy of each look like? Lo and behold, they're half, right? So you can see here, it's kind of half. From this one, the 3 have half black, half brown. The one here is like mostly black with a little bit of brown. So it makes sense for us. Like, if you have 2 copies of this, you're fully black of the asparagine. If you have 2 copies of aspartic acid, you're fully orange. If you have 1 copy of each, you're kind of halfway. Which was really, we were pretty happy with that result. And the interesting thing is that this exact mutation in the exact same position also creates black sheep and black pigs. So it's pretty remarkable that evolution has found this, like the same solution all the way across in a different group of organisms, right? And so we were pretty happy with this result. You know, we would think, okay, this one mutation can create these black birds, and it seems to be important in driving the origin of species. And it's also found in pigs and sheep, which is kind of cool. And so we decided, well, there might be a lot more other stuff. In this age of genomics, when you can kind of sequence so much more with so little money, we decided to do this with our birds. And with a quick scan of the genome, we found 70,000 markers, which is unbelievable. Nowadays, you can do full genomes. But at the time we did this, we got 70,000 markers. And we wanted to see, are there other genes that are very different between the black and the brown? And this is just quickly, I know it's kind of confusing. This is what's called a Manhattan plot, because it looks like the Manhattan skyline. And on the vertical axis is just how different two populations are in a particular marker. 0 meaning they're identical, 1 meaning they're completely different, like the MC1R, right? And these different colors are different chromosomes of the birds. Each dot is a marker, and you can see they kind of hug the bottom here. Very small differences throughout the genome, all across the board, including the sex chromosome here. And if you look at MC1R, it's way up here, right? In fact, if you just look at those melanic birds, MC1R is at 1. So it really does look like that single gene is what's driving the difference between the two populations, and it's driving that start of the origin of species. Now, of course, I bet people here are if you're not asleep, you realize there's another black population to the north. What's going on there? So we sequenced those guys too. This is what I've already showed you. And when we first got the results, we were kind of bummed. So we have black birds that actually have the genes of the orange or chestnut birds. So initially we're like, oh, dang, you know, well, something's weird happening, but we're pretty sure it's the right genes because it creates black pigs and sheep as well. And at this time, I was up for tenure, and so I figured I better publish this paper anyways, so I did, and it was fine. And so, but the spin there now is that maybe something different is happening in that black population to the north. And we go back to that complex again, and we know, for instance, that if you do not have that, if you do not have that agouti protein, you're going to create black organisms because they're always binding to alpha MSH. If you knock out, if you remove that agouti protein, you're going to get black horses and black mice. So he said, all right, then the next one is agouti. Hopefully we'll be batting at 2 for 2 when we do this. So we know that agouti has two parts to it, a backbone, a rigid backbone that binds to MC1R, and a soft tail that binds to attractin. And we found one mutation, isoleucine to threonine at that tail that binds to attractin. So what's going on there? So we were kind of excited to what's going on with that one. All the chestnut birds and the blackbirds in Santa Ana, with a couple of pesky heterozygotes, but I won't go over that for this part, have isoleucine, 2 copies of isoleucine, just like the MC1R had 2 copies of aspartic acid. And what we found is that all the blackbirds here had 2 copies of threonine. Perfect association between the two. And so what we think is going on is that even in this small scale, yeah, so it was pretty cool to find birds and sheep and pigs have the same mutation, but even in this small scale here, between populations, you can have the same physical appearance mediated by different genetic mutations. In other words, evolution have found different solutions to solve the same problem. I'm going to skip that one for time's sake. So we are still studying all these other populations. For instance, this one here, the melanic birds here, the black population and the chestnut population in this small island, we're really focusing on. And we've sequenced this, and what do you think the answer is? It's neither. So we don't have the answers yet. So it looks like even within the single group, there's 3 different ways to create the same physical appearance, 3 different mutations. And hopefully, next time you hear me say something, that we will know the solution to that question. So overall, what we think is happening is that plumage and song are important, that there's, I didn't present this evidence, but basically the evidence we have is that the selection is that if you mate with the wrong kind, you don't get to control territories. And that's the selection that's acting. It's not on food, it's not on survival, but it's on finding mates. And that we also found that the single mutation is passed on from generation to generation, and the intriguing idea that you can have just one genetic change to start the creation of a new species, which is pretty exciting for us. So answering, at least addressing Darwin's mystery of mysteries, we think we have some part of the solution that the birth of biodiversity, at least in our group, can be initiated by one simple mutation. It doesn't have to be complex. So now I'm going to transition to what we're doing to try to solve some of the problems that we're faced with as a society. How can we slow down the 6th mass extinction event? I already pointed this out to you that most scientists now agree that we are facing a pretty dire conditions, and we are, as a species, are the only ones that are capable of doing something about it. The main culprit, as you can imagine, is habitat conversion. So this is the most recent United Nations report on conversion of forest. The dark green is forest, the light green is agriculture. The vertical axis here, if it's positive, in millions of hectares, a positive change, meaning a creation of a kind of habitat, and negative is loss. So you can see here, in boreal, really cold forests, in temperate forests like here in Pennsylvania, and in the subtropics like Miami, there's a general positive dark green and a negative light green, meaning that we're reclaiming some of this agriculture to turn into forests. That's great news, right? But the sad news is this. In the tropics, which cradles Earth's greatest terrestrial diversity, we are losing a lot of forests to the song of 7,000 hectares every year, which is basically almost 60% of Pennsylvania is lost every year, right? That's a pretty big chunk if you think that, this report is just only for 10 years. So we're losing rainforests and forests in general in the tropics at an alarming rate, and this is driving some of the extinction, or at least threats to extinctions that we see. This is what it looks like in the Solomon Islands where clear-cut logging is happening. This is from afar. This is from nearby. So it's a really sad thing to look at because it's a beautiful, pristine forest that basically, unlike some of the logging operations that we see in places like North America, they just use bulldozers, right? Because it's much quicker. This is what a pristine river system would look like, and this is what it looks like after logging, right? Silt, mud. So it's not just the area that was logged, but the roots that's holding the soil is now just being eroded and it goes straight into the river. And this river is used by people downstream. This is what a beautiful lagoon would look like, where streams and rivers are emptied out. This is what it looks like after logging. So it's a really, really, really detrimental operation because it is large scale and quick. On the other side too, that islands face is climate change. Scientists are now really agreeing that our emissions, especially carbon dioxide, but also other greenhouse gases, is causing some of the climate change. So here's just an estimate based on core samples from dating all the way back to 10,000 years, and the amount of carbon dioxide on the vertical axis is pretty good, even during this time frame. But something happened in this time frame from the 1800s to 2000, and it coincides, coincidentally, with the Industrial Revolution. Right? And this increase in greenhouse gases is increasing our temperature. Here's basically from the 1800s up to now, increase in temperature. And the estimate is by the end of the century, it'll be 3 to 7 degrees warmer. And what does this mean? It means sea levels rise, sea levels are rising, and this is from the New York Times the other day. A massive ice sheet in our Antarctic is just about to fall off, right? This is from space, a picture here with a crack. It's a 900 feet crack, and it's just growing really, really fast, and so we're going to lose it pretty soon. This is what climate change will do to islands like Fiji. Here's looking at Fiji from the top. The dots are cities, the green are mangrove forest. This is 15 years later, you lose the mangroves and the forest because it's being inundated. You're losing populations there. You're losing more in 40 years. And by the end of the century, you've lost all these pieces of land, right? This is the islands, and they have very little to do with the CO2 emissions, and so it's kind of unfortunate for them. So what can we do? So I'm going to conclude what we're trying to do. So carbon emissions, this is the latest estimate from 2014. 3 countries almost make up half of the carbon emissions. US is number 2, China's number 1, India's number 3. Right, so there's definitely many things that we can do for cleaner air, and hopefully that's the direction we're going regardless of where the administration goes. The other is conservation. And what we're doing now is basically a grassroots approach of trying to do conservation work. In other words, rather than working with big organizations, which is awesome, like Worldwide Fund or Conservation International. What we're doing is starting from the ground up. We're going through communities and empowering communities, because I feel that that is probably the most lasting ways to make conservation. If you change the perspective of the people who actually own and manage this land, that's going to be far more effective than trying to legislate something to the entire population. So for instance, community conservation areas or indigenous protected areas are now being established. Roughly about 1.6 million square miles of forest are owned by indigenous community. That's 11% of the global forest. So that's a pretty big chunk that we can tackle by just talking to and convincing these indigenous communities. And so that's what we're doing. So in the Solomon Islands, we do educational outreach. We talk to local communities. Here's me and my wife talking to various tribes and just basically not telling them what to do, but giving them the data, giving them the perspective, a global perspective of the value of their resources. So that when loggers come in and offer them $100 for a hardwood tree, they know, it's kind of worth a lot more than that, right? And they'll have at least a second thought in deciding whether they should do clear-cut logging or not. The other way is we actually train the local land stewards. So this is me training my local guides on how to do science. We do camera traps for biodiversity. And the idea there is that they can do this themselves. They can actually be active participants in collecting data so that they really understand what's going on, right? They really understand the value of the resources and what they have. And of course, educating the next generation is probably the most important one. And so we go to schools and give presentations, and it does, it may sound very hard to do because you're doing it one at a time, but the change in perspective for this future stewards of the land actually, I think, is a very, very important thing to do. And finally, I think we need to put our money where our mouth is. So local empowerment is the most important thing. So University of Miami, we've set up a research station in the middle of nowhere in the Solomon Islands. We partnered with a local community that owns this tiny island where we built a research station. And basically in that research station, we take students from the University of Miami. They're turning it into an eco-lodge so that they can actually get money from doing this in lieu of logging, in lieu of overfishing. So when we talk about conservation, there's monetary gains for them for not over harvesting. And then finally, and we're very excited with this because this is just formed, we are now trying to set up a reserve, 180 square kilometers, 70 square miles. It doesn't seem big, but it's actually pretty big in the Solomon Islands. And so we're trying to set up this network of conservation areas among 3 communities. So you can imagine the politics behind this and my now transition from a scientist to basically an orator and talking to people and making big speeches. But convincing these 3 communities alone to agree to this has been a big step forward, while everybody around them is doing logging. And so we're pretty excited about this initiative. This is the area we're talking about, and just to kind of put things in perspective, it's the size of Baltimore, essentially, and about half the size of Philly. And inside that zone is this beautiful, stunning, you can't see it too well here, but cloud forests at the very top, pristine riverine system all the way to the bottom, and this basin that I already showed you, estuary system that's pristine. So we're pretty excited. We're trying to partner with donors. We're trying to partner with the university to find ways to keep this intact forest, because it also contains a lot of endemic species found nowhere else but that island in the Solomons. So with that, I want to leave you with one thought. So we are, most scientists agree that we are entering, or we are in the midst of the 6th mass extinction event caused by us, and only we can stop it. And so a lot of people might be thinking this is doom and gloom, what can we do? And this paper that I showed you showing that the extinction event can happen up to 100 times the natural background extinction rate. What can we do? And at least they end their paper by saying this, that there is still time to avert this massive decay of biodiversity, but that window for opportunity is rapidly closing. So I think it's an important thing to do. And this is going to affect you guys more than me. I'm going to be long dead before a lot of these things happen. So you and your children are going to be the ones that are affected. So it really is up to you guys to do something about it. If you want to learn more about this, rather than posting email, and stuff like that, just go on Google and look for Islands of Creation, which is a documentary in our work, or Trop Biolab, which directly takes you to our lab group. And you can find out more about the things that we do if you're interested in both the science and the conservation. And with that, I'll take questions if folks have any.
Hi again. I'm Rachel. I'm a junior here. And I was wondering how receptive you feel that these local communities that you're working with are to the like sort of sustainability and environmentalist initiatives that you're pushing.
So it's been 8 years since I started working in the Solomons. So initially when I came there, where loggers and commercial fishermen are coming in, they were very open to that because that's their sole source of income. And so they were kind of skeptical about a Westerner coming in telling them how to do things. So it took a few years, and so now we're kind of embedded in the community, for better or for worse. We're part of the community. And I guess I should have mentioned that a lot of these grassroots efforts also require that the people running it are considered as part of the community rather than an outsider. So after several years of working there and being part of it, they became a lot more receptive because they feel now that I have something at stake, that my wife and I have something at stake, so they're very open. And the success, for instance, of that research station is now spreading around neighboring communities. We hope that if we end up establishing that conservation area, it's going to spread across the other communities. And in the end, I think what's going to matter most is direct evidence that these things are successful and they'll be more receptive. Nowadays, they're super receptive. They've realized that now that logging has come through, that they see their neighbors where logging has come through, where they lost the resources, so that's a bad thing, obviously, and they don't have it anymore. But they've also seen a decay in the culture from the loggers. Bad things come through, and so now they're really understanding it more, and so they're far more receptive. So the three communities basically are just asking, how do we do this, and show us the way to do this, but we also need to see some outcome, and they don't see like a 5-year plan as a good plan. They want to see a 2-year plan. So it's a race that we're trying to do. But to answer your question, that was a long answer, they're becoming a lot more receptive nowadays.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi.
Hello, my name is Michael. I'm a member of the freshman class. And in terms of the grassroots efforts that you mentioned earlier, I know you mentioned you were teaching them science and I guess lessons about the extensive logging and the devastation and how to get more money for trees. I'm curious as to what exactly you try to teach in these efforts. I guess is it small lessons in economics, or is it more so what is the science that you're teaching them?
Yeah.
I'm just curious.
So as I said, I'm not a conservation biologist, so I know nothing about these things. So we're not that far along yet, but the first thing that we are now trying to set up is not necessarily a lesson in economics, but definitely a lesson in bookkeeping is the first thing. So in these communities, we tell them, all right, we need to form a committee. We need to get you a bank account. We need to register you as a non-for-profit as a first start. Otherwise, they can't receive money, right? Otherwise, we're just giving money to some random person. And so they're learning in that level. The field station, we're teaching them bookkeeping, but also hospitality. So our students are the guinea pigs, basically. They learn from what the students want and need. Anything from very simple things like potable water or clearly washing your hands before preparing food. And basically things like that, they're now taking to the next level of ecotourists. So we are not yet at the level of, well, they will get an economics kind of theory, but they are at the level of a more practical economics where we're trying to teach them now that they're entering a monetary economic global market. For the past thousands of years, they've been basically living off their land. They're having to learn what all of this is about. Like, what does a savings account mean? Like, our first year where we ran this field station, they spent the entire profit in 1 month. And we're like, whoa, you need to put some aside because if that house breaks down, you got to fix it and all this stuff. And so we, along with them, are learning the economics and how to run these conservation programs. And I think even though it sounds inefficient, I think what that does is it entails trust. So they know that we're in there with them. We're deep into the conservation efforts, and that has been working well. That's a long answer, but the short answer is we're not that sophisticated yet. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Hi.
Hello. I just had a quick question about the flycatcher data. I was wondering if you had seen anything where the flycatchers with the mixed belly colors, like, would they attack the species like how you showed, where if it was a chestnut color, it would only attack the chestnut? With the mix, would they attack both? Sorry.
That is an awesome question. And the answer there is very simple. The half chestnut, half black birds do not, or it has a hard time defending territories. So what we think is happening is that if you kind of don't look like the rest of them because they're all interacting, they have a really hard time defending or getting even to the stage of having a territory. So the ones that we caught that were half were actually just floating around in the trees. They weren't running territories. So we don't know yet because they're not defending territories. But I think at the same token, the fact that they can't defend those territories is a huge selection against them, right? In order to procreate, in order to have a nest, you need a territory. And these guys and gals seem to have a hard time being part of that system. And so the answer there, I think, is that there is a disadvantage to them being half black, half brown. But we don't know how they react because we can't run the experiments because they're up in the trees kind of hanging around. So what we're doing now, we're doing the reverse, is we're putting cameras at nest and turning full brown birds half black, just to see what happens. And from that, we can see. We can see, for instance, if we turn a male half black, what does the partner do? Does it all of a sudden abandon that nest? Or probably what we're expecting is they allocate less resources to the young because all of a sudden the partner is kind of, he's kind of suboptimal, and they pass it on to the future. But the quick answer is we don't know yet because they don't hold territories. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi.
Hi. I just had a question also about the flycatcher data. So I was just wondering, with these simulations of the bird calls with the mounted birds, did you see any kind of change in like territorial behavior due to like the idea of a highly aggressive territory? Was there any kind of population movement within the birds?
Yeah, so we didn't. They were very stable, and especially I think we were catching them at the time they were already building nests, so it's unlikely for them to abandon it. The interesting thing that we did find, which I think is also part of the selection story, is that the melanic birds, when they get angry, up to 5 birds would come down and defend the territory. But the brown one is always the male, and the female will come second and kind of hang around. But the blackbirds, there's like a group would come down. So I think even in that perspective, there's a different social structure between the islands that really creates a different selection. And in this case, it's not seed, it's not food, it's the social milieu, if you want to call it that, of what's going on around it. Yeah. Thank you.
Going back to the community and grassroots conservation questions, do you collaborate with other biologists in the area studying different organisms that are being affected by similar changes in the environment? For example, to give a local example, the largest salamander in North America, the hellbender, is found in these areas and all through Appalachia, and is severely threatened by all of the silt and the debris in the water, as we saw in your pictures.
Yeah.
So there are many organisms that are being affected. Do you collaborate with other biologists?
Thanks for that. We absolutely do. So for instance, the Solomon Islands Museum in the capital has an herbarium. So we're collaborating now with some plant folks because I know nothing about plants, for instance, and so they will help. We have a freshwater ecologist who was there a few years ago, and now we're trying to get him back also from the Solomon Island National Museum. And they in fact discovered a few new freshwater insect species in these rivers. So he's going to be part of the team now too that's going to evaluate what's out there. And then finally we have a herpetologist, again another local person that's helping us characterize what's going on. Yeah, so the short answer, we are, but it's trying to get money to actually fly them in there and pay them is the next step. The youngest F&M student.
My name is Noam, and I'm from Buchanan Elementary, and I was wondering if the coloration varies between female and male in the flycatchers.
Oh, excellent question. Right. So that we had thought that it might, because if you don't know this, birds, so vertebrates like humans and most mammals have 3 cones. We have the short wavelength for blue, the middle for yellow, green, and the long for red. Birds have a fourth cone in the ultraviolet, so they can see in the ultraviolet. So we were thinking, just like you asked, that maybe males and female actually look different, even though in hand they don't, maybe in the ultraviolet. And so we've used a spectrophotometer, which can quantify the color in an unbiased way, and we found no difference. So, and we looked at the size of males and females, and we also found no difference. So it looks like the way they can tell each other apart is through behavior. We can't tell them apart, so we actually have to do it backwards. We have to go back home, do the genetics, and see, oh, this is a female, this is a male. But they can, and it looks like it's behavior. But great question.
Hi, I'm Amy Molnix, a biologist at heart. Could you talk about why having a liberal arts background, in addition to having a strong science background, has been important in your career?
Oh, a good question, and way to put me on the spot. Nah, but I agree. So my background too is, I've been teaching, Miami is a medium-sized liberal arts college. Before Miami, I was at Syracuse University, which is also a medium-sized liberal arts college. When I was an undergrad, I was in a massive university, but that's a different story. But I turned it into a liberal arts education. So when I was an undergrad, I was a dual major in comparative religion and science and biology. And the idea there, my initial idea is like, look, why are we here? We're trying to find answers, right? And I thought, well, on the one side, culture has answers to why we're here, and the other side is biology. And so I explored both. And having that perspective has really changed the way I approach science in a more holistic and integrative way, right? We are trained to be scientists to kind of focus on like laser precision to what we're doing. But what I've really realized is this more integrative approach has really helped kind of characterize and kind of help form what I'm doing, both as a scientist and now as a conservation biologist, right? This very broad background, when I was an undergrad, taking things like comparative religion and anthropology, and I even took classic Tibetan and things like that, has really kind of broadened my perspective. So when I interact with these communities, I think it's much easier for me to interact with them. I was telling some students last night after the documentary, the one thing I really love about the Solomon Islands is at the end of the day, we sit around a fire without TV, without electronics, and the art of storytelling is still there. And I think a liberal arts education has allowed me to kind of interact with them, rather than being a scientist where everything is so rigid, that these different perspectives that you take from different disciplines can really form both consciously and subconsciously how you approach questions in life. Yeah. Thank you.